Hello all, this is NaveenPrabhu. Today we are going to look at the game between Foreest Jorden and Anish Giri. This game actually featured in the round 11 of Tata Steel 2022 Masters League. This game is quite interesting to watch. I hope you guys like it. Let's go into the game. Here they goes for the Nimso Indian defense with the move d4, nf6, c4 and he pushes the pawn to e6. Here he goes for knight to c3 and here he plays the bishop on b4. This is known as the Nimso Indian opening. And actually we are yesterday seeing the game between Vidit and Pragnananda where Vidit goes for the queen to c2 move in this opening. But here Foreest opts to go for a a3 push and asking the bishop whether to capture the knight or to move back. Here he just captures the knight and he recaptures back. And he just pushes the pawn to b6, idea of financiating the bishop on b7 and controlling this diagonal here. So Foreest want to blend the diagonal, so he pushes the pawn to f3 and idea of putting the pawn forward on e4, which majorly control lot of squares on the center. Now he goes for knight to c6 and he start pushing his e pawn here, and here Anish Giri wants to attack the c4 pawn because that's the only weak pawn in the situation, weak double pawn here. So he wants to attack here with also some ideas of putting the bishop and attacking here. So he just want to defend the pawn, so he just develops the bishop on d3 here, and after the bishop comes he wants to put his queen and want to defend this pawn here. Now that maybe you can also go for something like knight to e2 and just concentrate on your development, don't worry about that pawn. Here Jorden wants to defend the pawn, so he plays the move queen to e2, and there should be one more attacker to attack this pawn. So here Anish Giri plays the move d6, idea of just putting the queen and taking the queen on the queen side to attack the pawn here. But here he goes for a f4 push, and this game is actually becoming a rare one because this game has only been reached only 6 times in this position has been only reached 6 times here. And here he goes for a queen to d7 as per his plan, and he's just developing his king side pieces and wants to castle on the king side. And note that you also want to open the f file for the rook, so you want to trade the pawn on f4 in this situation. Somehow if the pawn is pushed forward he will just hit it and have an open file for his rook here. Now he goes for a queen to a4 here. The three pieces are attacking the pawn on c4 here, and there is no good squares for the queen to enter on the queen side here. The only square is b3 square, and we also want to defend the c4 square and the b3 square. So Foreest Jorden goes for a move knight to d2, which defends the c4 square and the b2 square. So our pawn is officially guarded 3 times, and there is nothing to worry about that. And we also guarding the c4 b3 square so that the queen can't enter in the game. Now he just pushes the pawn forward. As I told you earlier, he wants the open file. He wants to capture with this f pawn. Here just he goes for a castle. If it captures, we can just capture back. And bit better move was to castle on the queen side in this variation, because it is too dangerous to castle on the king side. But in the game he just goes for a king side castle because this is too dangerous, because the black pieces are aligned on the queen side in this variation, but the king and the rook and the knight only on the queen side. It is a bit dangerous for black to defend the position when the position opens out in the king side. Here Jorden goes for a pawn trade, and after the pawn captures, he just want to check up this line of b file, so he puts his line in this way. Now Anish Giri goes for a c5 move, that is threatening the center, want to weaken the center in this way, because after captures and he will get a here. Otherwise we want to push our pawn in this situation. But seeing that Jorden has an interesting move in this variation, that is he goes for a rook captures in this line. Rook captures f6. That is an exchange sacrifice here. Before we are looking at this move, I want to show you a sample move in this line. That is, instead of playing the move c5, that is a big mistake move in this variation. We can also take our pieces on to the towards the king side, so to helps to defend our king side in this way. If we put our rook on e8, there is no exchange sacrifice in this variation because after the position opens out, it is bit equal to play the game. There is no clear win for white or black in this way. But this actually gives a clear win in this way because after coming here, there is nothing to go for here because we will just capture here and the pawn X has to capture our rook here. And as you see, the position is open out. It actually invites our queen to give him check, and also we can also thread in some mating ideas on the g7 square with our bishop combining. It will be very good for white in this way. This exchange sacrifice is very powerful here. Maybe you just figure out on the board itself. Here he goes for a queen to f3, attacking the pawn on f6, and also the idea of putting the bishop on h6 and threatening the mate as usual. But instead of playing the queen to f3, it is a bit slow as there is an interesting line that is faster. We can just go for the kill here. That is, we have to play the move knight to b3 here. It's look like we are giving up the piece here, but we will just put the bishop on here, and then combining we can play our queen here and attack the f6 square. And note that we can't able to move our rook now. If he does now, that is a mate in 2. That is, we can give the check, and after the king moves, we can just give him a checkmate here. So that can't be possible. So the king have to move in the situation. After the king moves, we have to attack the f6 pawn here and threaten some mate on g7. The queen need to defend this, and after that we will start attacking the queen here. After the queen moves, we can just pick up the rook, and after the queen captures, we can just hit the knight here. That is, for example, after the queen captures, we can just hit the knight here, and it is a very good position for white to play on, whereas it is not easy for black to continue this position. But in the game, he first goes for a queen to f3 here, and then the queen comes to c6 and defend the pawn on f6 here. Now he start pushing his pawn and attacking the queen, and as you see, this bishop and the knight are very useless pieces for the black side because our pieces are coming towards his king, but it can't able to defend the game in this situation. It is not at all good for black here. Here the queen comes to d6 here, and he wants to take all his pieces towards the king, starting from knight f3 and ideas of something and invading in this way and some mating ideas here. So the king just moves away and the knight jumps to e3 square here, and he's taking all his pieces towards the king side, some controlling the lines here. But it is bit slow because our pieces are coming faster than the black pieces here. Here he just puts his bishop here, idea of just shifting the bishop here, e1 and coming to h4 square and threading an attack on the f6 square, which is too hard to defend here. And he goes for a rook to g3 and some ideas of bishop coming to h3 if the queen ever moves this line. And here he puts the bishop on e1, and as per idea you want to shift the bishop, but it actually blocks the rook's pathway of coming to the king side. So it is bit good if the rook first shift to the f1 square and then combining with the bishop on the e1 square. But Jorden goes for this stuff. That is, first he goes for bishop to e1, and after the rook comes to g6, he goes to the h4 and threatening attack on the f6, an idea of just shifting the rook to f1 and creating some pressure here. So the rook attacks the bishop here and the queen have to defend the bishop in the situation. And here he puts his bishop on d7, an idea of taking the another rook into the king side, which may be useful in few cases. And he goes for a rook to f1 as per the plan and creating some attack on this area. And here the king have to defend this, and it is not that great move in the situation, but great was to just to shift our knight to the king side, and we have to give up the pawn here. That is not at all a issue in this situation, but we have to take our pieces towards the king. That's the important point in this. There is no time in saving the pawn, but here Anish Giri actually goes for saving the pawn in the situation, which is not at all good. Because our pieces are so strong in this variation, and we can also expect some check ideas in this variation, which is too odd. And we also have knight coming in. If the bishop ever moves, that will be a family fork around the rook, queen and the king. It is too dangerous in this situation. The rook blocks here, and here Jorden plays a move, some kind of waiting move in this situation. That is, he goes for h3 push. That is, he just inviting black to capture the h3 pawn, and as per the plan, Anish Giri just captures the pawn here. Now he just attacks the rook in this way, so that if the pawn are not to capture, the rook have to stay in this line. But you see the g5, g4 and g3 squares are covered by our two bishops. So the rook can't stay in this line as the rook is attacked under g6. So the only good move is to move the bishop here. That is, the bishop goes back and we can just hit the rook in this way. And after the rook captures, and you note that the rook has been doing a good job of guarding the f6 pawn here. Now there is no guard on the f6 pawn. We can just capture with our bishop and give this check. And the bishop goes back. And we can just take our queen and threatening some ideas of queen to h6. If he is not aware of that, we can just go for a checkmate ideas here. But he just placed a correct move in this situation. That is, he puts his rook to f8. Now we don't have rook to queen to h6 because the rook actually pick up the bishop in this line. So it is not possible like in this way. So now he goes for a rook to f3. Some ideas of putting the rook on the g or h file. If the bishop ever moves, we can just shift our rook to h file and create the attack on the h7 square. But there is an interesting move than this to play on this situation, because instead of playing our rook here, we can just put our bishop on e7 and attacks the rook and the queen here, forcing the rook to capture our rook. And after we capture, and after the king captures, counter attacking our queen, we can give this check, and after the queen blocks, we can just continue the game by capture the pawn, and we can also consider start pushing our d and e pawns into the queen. It is a best pawn for white here. And as you see, we actually get our material back, and black is actually having this knight, which is very hard for him to get back into the position. So it is considered as a piece down for black in this situation, which is out of the game here. But here Jorden just goes for a rook to f3, and he goes for a rook to f7, and now we have to put our queen and take this pawn and start pushing the e pawn and d pawn here. Or we can also shift our knight somewhere into the game. Any move is winning for white. Here he goes for queen to g5 and attacks the pawn here. He just goes back because we can't able to save the pawn here because there is two attackers in the situation. So the queen goes back. Here he captured with his queen, and the knight. Now only the knight is started entering into the position here. Now he just put his queen back and preparing to push the e pawn and d pawn this way, which is hard for black to defend. And we can also have some ideas of forking the bishop and the rook here, which is too dangerous. And the knight comes to d5, and here he start pushing his e pawn here. The knight goes back and attacking our bishop here. He just pushes the d6 pawn. Now the knight have to capture here, because if the knight is staying in that line, that is not at all good. Because if the knight stays, we can just start considering putting our knight and on h6, and it will be not good for black. We can just hit the rook here after the king ever moves. So the knight captures in this way, and we captures. And as you see that our f pawn and d pawn are too dangerous, only 2 steps ahead to queen in this line. So we have to just eliminate the bishop and the rook here. After that we can just start pushing our pieces, 2 pawns into a queen. Now Anish Giri goes for a queen to e8, maybe a last try to just check on the king here after the knight moves. So Jorden just moves the knight, invites Anish Giri to give this check, and after he goes to h2, there is no more checks in the position. The queen is helpless in the situation. So the queen just goes to d1. As you see, the pawns are officially guarded. You can't even capture the c pawn or c3 pawn and c4 pawn, which is officially guarded well. So he just pushes the queen to d1 and waits for what Jorden moves in this situation. Here he gives him this check and forces the king to move on h8 square. And here he plays a killing move in the situation. I give you a few seconds. You can also try it on yourself. I hope you guys found this move, that is rook to h3, which creates an attack on the h file, and you note that the king can't come to g8 or g7, which is controlled by our pawn and the knight here. And our idea was to capture the pawn with our knight and give him the check. And note that the bishop can't just capture the rook in this variation, because if he does, we can just start considering pushing the pawn here, which is too dangerous. Because we are going to queen the pawn, now the queen have to capture it. We can just give him this check, and we have to start giving up the pieces here. There is no saving the mate in the situation. You have to give up the queen. There is no point in playing this game after losing the queen here. It is completely winning for white. So Anish Giri knows that, so he resigned the position in this point after the rook comes to h3 here. And our idea was to just to capture this pawn if he defended it well. That is, he can't able to capture the rook here. If he plays some other moves like example a5 was the best move for black. There is nothing best. That was a way to continue the position. We can't able to push the pawns. That was the only move to push our pawns. That was our plan. If the bishop doesn't capture the rook, we will just capture the pawn and give him this check. And it is pretty much winning for us, because after that we will just threaten some open checks here after. So the queen have to block. We can just opens the diagonal here. The queen has to trade now. We will give this check, and after the king moves, we will capture the rook here. After the king captures, we can just deliver this check, and the king have to defend here. We can just start giving him this check, and it is not at all easy for him to defend. We can even consider hitting the bishop, and after he captures, we can start pushing and queening our f pawn here. The king can't defend the pawn to queening here, which is pretty much winning after this move. This move was something difficult to spot. Well, Jorden spots the move correctly. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hit the like button if you like the video. Keep supporting to this channel, and thank you for your support. Let's see you in the next video.